Welcome to our next online talk, Maxine, Science Goes Public program. We are happy to have you here with us again. Every Tuesday, scientists of our institute present parts of their life and work in this format. We still hope the software does its job well and we don't have any technical problems. Today we are happy to have Nora Carlson with us. She first studied modern language and literature, Japanese and Chinese in Ohio, USA. Afterwards, you start with wildlife biology in the University of Montana in United States. How was that? You first studied language and literature, and how did you come to biology?
So actually, when I first went to university, I wanted to be a doctor. But I very quickly realized that most of the classes that I was taking in cellular biology and microbiology and genetics, I didn't actually like that much. I loved classes in ecology and behavior, but not really a lot of the stuff that I would need to be a doctor. But at the same time, I was taking language classes and I loved my language classes. I loved trying to understand how different people communicate. And so I ended up majoring in language. And then I spent a year teaching English, but realized I really missed science. And so it was when I was making the decision of whether or not I wanted to go and start studying science again, that I learned about bioacoustics. And bioacoustics is the study of animal vocal communication. So basically how animals talk to each other. And this was very similar in some ways to what I had already studied, this idea of how individuals communicate. And ever since then, that's been where I'm really interested in, is how animals communicate with each other and how this affects their ability to live and survive in their environment.
So where did you go then after Montana, United States, where you started with that?
So I actually ended up going to St. Andrews in Scotland. I ended up there partially because one of the people whose research I based my undergraduate research on there was working at St. Andrews. And so I talked to him quite a bit. But also because St. Andrews has many, many people that study bioacoustics. And it's one of the few universities in the world that does. So that's where I ended up, was in Scotland, which was pretty awesome.
After that, you were also in Portugal, and then you ended up with us in our institute in 2018 with the Marie Curie Individual Fellowship with Ian Cousin, the Department of Collective Behavior. And now you are back in nearby Seattle on a small island. And your talk today has the title Noisy Neighbour, Human Noise and Animal Communication. So some words to the audience today. Again, feel free to ask questions anytime in our chat. However, remember that you have to sign up in YouTube for this. After the talk, we will come back to all your questions and ask them to Nora. And now I would like to hand over to you, Nora. Thanks for being here, and we are looking forward to hear what you have to tell us.
Okay, so hello everybody again. So I'm Nora, and as you just heard, I have kind of a different type of background in that I started with human communication and then moved on to animal communication. And one of the things that I found after studying animal communication was once again how humans are kind of butting in, because humans make a lot of noise. And it started being very clear that human noise may actually be causing problems for animals trying to communicate. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I want you to see this nice picture and listen very carefully to not only the animal noises, but the other noises as well. So you can hear some bird song. And then there's some other noises in there. And these other noises start to get a bit louder, and it's harder to hear the bird song. Now, this is something that animals have been dealing with for actually a very long time. Humans in general are getting noisier and noisier and noisier over time. And I really like showing this graph, or not this graph, but this image, because this is a very good illustration of exactly how much humans have actually impacted the planet. You have all sorts of different types of human noise processes or infrastructures. So things like cities in red and boat routes in blue, roads in green, and airplane networks in white. And what this shows is that there's almost nowhere left on the entire planet that doesn't have some amount of human-generated or anthropogenic noise. And we know that this noise can be particularly devastating for a lot of species. So for a very long time, when scientists would think about the types of impacts that something has, that we do on the environment, for example, cutting a road through a forest, the thought was, well, cutting a road through the forest, destroying part of the forest, that's what's causing the problem. That's why we're seeing species disappear and numbers drop. But in 2013, a group of scientists got together and said, well, it seems like the effects of cutting a road into the forest happen far beyond the road. Maybe it's not just cutting a road, maybe it's also the noise that that road makes. So what they did is they went to an area that had no roads, no human structures. They looked at all of the birds that they could find, how many there were, how many species there were, and then they created an acoustic road. So a road made only of noise. And in as little as 4 days after they put this road up, what they saw is a decrease in the total number of birds and even the disappearance of some bird species. So these birds are trying to avoid all of this noise. They're disappearing. So noise itself can drive drops in the number of species around. Now, this is something that scientists are becoming more and more aware of how dangerous noise can be. And there's a fair amount of research trying to understand how noise actually causes problems. We know, for example, that noise can cause stress. So if you play noise or human-generated noise at a bunch of different species, they have changes in their stress response. So the chemicals in their body change or their behavior changes because of this noise. We also know that another big factor in noise, another big cause, is something called acoustic masking. Now, this is what you heard earlier, where one noise basically covers up or masks another noise. So if you have a cricket singing to attract females and you have a bunch of noise as well, the females can't hear that noise or they can't hear the signal, they can't hear the crickets because the noise is too loud. And this acoustic masking can happen on a bunch of different types of signals. So sexual signals, so song in birds and frogs and crickets, where they're trying to attract a female. Also in anti-predator signals, so in calls that birds use to try to make sure they don't get caught or eaten by predators. Also in social signals, so calls where individuals are telling each other who they are or where they are. So today I'm going to talk to you about acoustic masking and how these systems kind of work in anti-predator signals and in social signals, because those are the two types of calls or vocalizations that I study. So first we'll talk about anti-predator signals. And in these signals or these calls, you have two general types that are most frequently studied. The first are alarm or flee calls. Now, for example, if you have a blue tit and it sees an actively hunting, very dangerous predator, it will give an alarm or flee call. And all of the other birds will flee. They'll hide, they'll freeze in order to make sure they don't get eaten. Now, a different type of anti-predator call are mobbing calls, and these are the calls that I study. So these are very different. In this case, for example, a blue tit will see a pygmy owl, and it starts producing mobbing calls, and this owl is not actively hunting. And what happens is when the blue tit makes mobbing calls, the other birds also come over, they get attracted, they also start making mobbing calls, and they start harassing and in some species even attacking the predator in order to get it to leave. And so we're going to talk about these calls today. So mobbing calls and mobbing behavior is something that humans have actually used for a very, very long time. In fact, we still do today. So this is a very old way that I think the Greeks used to catch birds. And what they would do is you can see a man sitting on the left of the pot. And what they would do is bird catchers would go to a tree and they would paint the branches in something called bird lime. And this is a technique that is still used today in some areas of the world. And they would paint the branches with bird lime, and they'd put a small, very scary or very dangerous predator, like a little owl, perching underneath this tree. And what would happen is the birds would come in to mob this little owl, and they'd get stuck in the bird lime because it's very sticky. And then the bird catcher can go over and he can basically pluck or pick the birds off the tree like fruit. Another painting I really like that kind of expresses mobbing is this painting by Tobias Stranover. Now, the reason I like this one so much is because it tries to communicate the power of mobbing. And so here there are a bunch of birds that are harassing this European eagle owl. And not only is the owl obviously a bit frightened of the situation, but if you look carefully, you start to see that the birds here aren't just from Europe. They're from North America, they're from South America, they're from other continents. So this is trying to express the idea that mobbing is so powerful that it's actually calling birds from other continents to come and harass this owl. Now, we have always been a bit concerned about acoustic masking, or since scientists have known about acoustic masking. And a couple of years ago, some scientists got together to ask the question as to whether acoustic masking or covering up of sound affects mobbing at all. So what they did is they played back mobbing calls, and as expected, the birds all came and mobbed the mobbing calls to try to figure out where the predator was, which we expect in a normal environment. But then they played back mobbing calls and road noise. And what they found is that the birds didn't respond. They didn't come over and start mobbing the speaker, which means they likely didn't hear the signal. And this is potentially very problematic because, well, on one hand, you might think, I mean, it's just one call and maybe they don't hear it. It's not that important. But the problem is that mobbing may actually be very, very important for entire species communities. One of the really powerful things about mobbing calls, and as someone who is interested in communication, I am very interested in about mobbing calls, is that they can contain information about the predator itself. For example, they can contain information about the size of the predator, whether it's very large or not, about the distance of the predator, whether it's really far away. even about the type of predator. Is it an owl or is it a hawk? And about the behavior of the predator itself. So is it actively hunting? Is it preening? Is it already feeding? And while we know that when an individual great tit, for example, sees a predator and starts making mobbing calls, we know that other great tits understand this. But we also know that other species understand this information as well. And even in species that might not understand the specific information, they still understand the level of danger. And so you have these large networks of information in these communities. And there's this idea that maybe there's one or two species that are really important in these networks, that they basically tell everybody else about all of the predators. And these would be community informants, because they inform the rest of the community about the predators that are around. Now, we think that the Paridae, which are the chickadees in North America, they have been likened to community informants a lot. So a lot of people think that they're community informants. But I wanted to know if the same family, so species in the same family in the UK, might also be community informants. So I wanted to see if they were community informants. So what I did is I presented all of these species with predators. So we had a partridge, just to make sure they weren't actually scared of taxidermies or taxidermied mounts. Then we had a buzzard, which is very big and not very good at catching small birds. So it ended up being a very kind of non-scary predator. Then we had a sparrowhawk, which is much smaller and very, very good at catching small birds. And so that is very, very scary and very dangerous. So we presented these predators to the 6 species of tits found in the UK. So we have coal tits, crested tits, marsh tits, willow tits, blue tits, and great tits. And the first question that we asked is, do you actually put information in your calls about these predators? And of the 6 species, 5 species did this. So 5 species in their calls, you could tell if they were responding to a very dangerous predator or a non-dangerous predator. But this may mean that your buddies, so the same species, can understand you, but that doesn't necessarily mean other species can understand you. So the next question was, well, how reliable is this information? If I hear a great tit, can I understand what that great tit is saying if there's one great tit or if there's 20 great tits? Does the great tit change how it calls, or does it always say the same thing every time it has a predator? So how reliable is it? And we found that only 3 species are really reliable in the way that they put this information in their calls. And that's coal tits, blue tits, and great tits. So the final piece of the puzzle is, well, if you're going to be a community informant, if you're going to tell other species about how dangerous these predators are, those other species have to actually listen to you. Not just one, but multiple other species have to listen. So we asked whether or not other species, more than one other species, actually pay attention to the information in these calls. And we found the only bird that more than one other species paid attention to were great tits. So great tits may end up being something like a community informant in these types of community systems. Now, actually putting information in calls is a very important part of mobbing. But we also think that mobbing is important for other reasons. One of those might be learning. So we think that individuals might use mobbing to learn about new predators. For example, if you have an adult and a chick, and the adult sees a bird, a predator that it mobs, and the chick has never seen this bird, because its parent is mobbing, it may now know, oh, well, that's a dangerous predator. And the next time it sees, it may also start mobbing in order to make sure that the predator leaves. Now we think that this might be happening but we're not entirely sure. In order for this to happen, though, we need to have birds that don't recognize new predators, because we do know that some species, even if they've never seen a predator before, will still know that it's a predator. So I wanted to find out if tits, so if the Paridae automatically recognize a new predator as dangerous, or if they have to learn that a new predator is dangerous. So to do this, I looked at tits across all of the UK. And this is partially because while you have tit species across all of the UK, you also have sparrowhawks across all of the UK, which are very dangerous. But little owls are only found in the southern part of the UK. And this means you have a population in the north, which has no experience with little owls, and a population in the south, which does have experience with little owls. So what we did is we asked, well, how do you respond to these two predators? Do you recognize them as dangerous? And as expected, both populations treated sparrowhawks as very dangerous. They both knew that sparrowhawks were dangerous and they had experience of sparrowhawks. Now the question was, how do they treat something like the little owl? If they automatically recognize a predator as a threat, even if they've never seen it before, both populations should treat little owls exactly the same, as very dangerous. However, if the birds in the north who have never seen the little owl before respond to it as non-dangerous, but the birds in the south who have seen it before respond to it as dangerous, then we know that they have to learn about whether or not a predator is dangerous. And that's exactly what we see. In the south, tits treat sparrowhawks and little owls both as very, very dangerous. But in the north, blue tits and great tits treat sparrowhawks as very dangerous, but little owls as non-dangerous. So what does all of this mean? So coming back to this idea of what are the problems with masking or covering up these mobbing calls? Well, the first thing is this idea that you might not just be covering up one species' information. You may be stopping an entire network of information, many other species that need this information from one or two other species in the community. Also, you might be making it harder for species to learn about new predators, either because they're young and they don't have experience of predators, or maybe because they are new migrants that have never been to this area, and so they're encountering some predators for the first time. But also, we know from other studies that mobbing species and the information is important in other ways as well. For example, if you have these species that listen to mobbing species or eavesdroppers, we know that they actually forage better when there are mobbing species around because they can rely on them for information about predators. They know that somebody else is keeping an eye out. They also help in something called boundary crossing. So if you have a big forest and you break it up into smaller pieces because of roads or houses or farms, suddenly you have these very small pieces of forest. And that means that many species can't live as easily. But if they could cross these boundaries, the boundaries of roads, for example, it would be much easier. But they don't want to cross these boundaries because it's dangerous. But if you have mobbing species around, they can help make these other species cross these boundaries and have a larger habitat that they can actually use because they actually have information about the dangers around them. Now, one of the things that I'm hoping to do in this next year is actually take what I know about mobbing in birds and look at mobbing in fish. And the reason is because we know fish mob. We know that fish can be incredibly noisy, and the amount of noise that humans have made underwater is almost worse than it is on land. And so if we are doing the same things to fish that we're doing to birds and other mammals, then maybe this is one of the reasons fish are not doing so well. So now that I've talked a bit about mobbing, we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the social calls that I study, which are specifically contact calls. Now, contact calls in general are calls that are used to help groups stay together and figure out and make decisions together. For example, in green woodhoopers, you have types of contact calls called separation calls, where if an individual gets lost from the group, they'll produce a call, and then the group itself will call, and then they'll call, and the group will call. And by doing this, the lost individual can find the group again. In white-faced capuchin monkeys, you also have instigation calls. So calls where, for example, if a group is sat foraging and somebody in the group wants to move to a new location, they will move to the edge of the group in that location and start calling. And if enough other individuals join that individual, then the whole group gets up and they start to go in a different direction to do something else. They can also change the direction a group is moving by doing something very similar. You also have calls in meerkats called spacing calls and contact calls, where individuals want to make sure that their neighbors aren't too far away so they don't get lost, but aren't too close so they're not kind of stealing their food or foraging on their patch. And so they have these calls that they make that they change how they call based on whether their neighbors are too close or whether they're too far away. Also, because they're making these calls all the time, this means that everybody in the group not only knows where everybody is, but they know who everybody in the group is. So until now, one of the problems with studying contact calls is that we have two main ways that we can study it. The first is we look at everybody in the group as a whole, so we treat the group almost as one individual, and we look at all of the calls in that group. Or we can look at one individual and the calls that they make, but we don't necessarily know what the rest of the group is doing. But to really understand how contact calls of all of the individuals change behavior of the rest of the individuals in the group, at who calls from where and when all of the time in everybody in the group. And so that's exactly what I'm doing in Warnrufe. So I'm working with a group of starlings in a place called the Imaging Barn, which is in Warnrufe at the Max Planck. And what we're doing is we're tracking flocks of birds. And we have two tracking systems. So the first system in green is the acoustic tracking system. This is a system where we use microphones to figure out where sounds are coming from. The second is the Vicon system. And this is an infrared visual tracking system, where we can tell where each individual is within a volume. So the way that the tracking systems work is for the acoustic tracking system, a starling will make a call, and that sound will hit the closer microphone before it hits the farther microphone. And by taking the difference in the amount of time it takes for that sound to hit the closer and farther microphone, we can basically put these numbers into a computer, do a lot of math, and it will be able to tell us exactly where that sound came from. With the Vicon system, or the infrared system, we use backpacks that have infrared reflective markers on them. So the cameras themselves actually send out infrared light, and it bounces off 4 infrared markers that we have on the backpacks. And each individual gets a different pattern, which means the system knows which individual is which, and it knows where it is. So if we know where an individual is, and we know where a sound comes from, we can figure out who is calling from where and when. Now, what we're doing is we're putting starlings in 4 different environments, and this is to test how they use visual information and how they use acoustic information to make decisions as a group. So the first environment is an easy environment. So on the screen, there are 4 foraging boxes. Now these boxes are filled with mealworms, which are like starling candy. They're very excited about mealworms. And because they're in the sawdust, they have to actually forage for them like they would in the wild. So in this environment, it's very easy to see and it's very easy to hear because it's quiet. Then we have a noisy environment where it's still very easy to see, but we have road noise like you would get in the wild, and so it's much harder to hear. then we have a visually obstructive environment. So basically it's difficult to see because they can't see through these kind of green barriers. But it's quiet so they can hear each other. And then finally we have the really difficult environment. And here they can't see each other very well and they can't hear each other very well either. So we have actually completed our experiments, but we have so much data that we're still trying to process all of it. So I can't tell you about actual results we have, but I can tell you about the predictions of what we think will happen. So in the visually open and quiet environment, we expect that starlings in the foraging area will remain quite spread out because they can see each other quite easily. That they'll call, but they might be kind of quiet and they won't call that often. And also that starlings in the perching or roosting area will take very direct flights. They'll know exactly where they want to go and they'll go there very easily. When we start making it noisy, we think that birds will still stay pretty spread out, still fly quite directly, but that they might get a bit louder. So they'll try to make themselves heard over all of the noise. When we make it very difficult to see, but quiet, we think that birds will start calling more, that they'll have to use the calls in order to figure out where each other are instead of being able to see where everybody else is. We also think that when birds decide to go to a foraging area, they'll spend more time in the air trying to figure out where they want to land, where others are. We also think that you might get more birds closer together so they can more easily see or hear each other. Then in the most difficult environment, we think that birds will be even closer together, that they'll try to be able to see each other and hear each other very well. We also think that they'll be quite a bit louder to try to be heard over the noise, and that birds, when they move into the foraging area, will spend even longer in the air trying to decide where to land. So just to give you an idea of what our data looks like when we first get it, I'll show you this. So this is what we get. You can see that there's all of these squares. Those are each individual birds in our system, and this is how we record it. So each color is a different individual bird. That's how we can keep track. And this is the perching area. And the foraging area is where they're kind of almost flying to and then back again. So at the very end of this, you'll see the birds fly down and actually come into the foraging area and start wandering around and walking around. And so this is eventually turned into numbers on a spreadsheet so we can actually analyze it using statistics. But it's always fun to watch the birds walk around, even though you can't see the birds themselves. I have to get this to actually move. Okay, so I'd like to end and come back to this graph or this image again, because I think that when we learn about pollution and when we think about how humans impact the planet, we don't really think about how noisy we are. We think about the chemicals that we put into the oceans and into the land. We think about how the planet is heating up because of how badly we've changed the atmosphere. We think about the destruction that we've done, so burning forests down or cutting forests down in order to make way for roads and towns and various other types of industries, about the oil spills. But we don't really think about the amount of noise that we make and the fact that there's no barriers to this noise, that this noise goes everywhere. Now, one of the really cool things that has happened recently as a result of the lockdowns is that we've had a quieter planet. And we're starting to see animals in places we didn't think we'd ever see them. And I know that some of my colleagues are already trying to collect data to try to figure out if we can actually understand the effect that our noise has on animals, separate from the effect of actually changing the environment in a physical way has on animals. But I just want you to think in the future when you go outside, just take a moment and listen. Think about all the natural animal sounds that you hear as opposed to all of the anthropogenic or human-generated noise that you hear. Think about the planes, think about the cars, think about all of that noise, and if there's a way we can actually lower that noise or change that noise so it's not making it so hard for animals to talk to each other. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the people that have supported and helped me through all of these experiments, both the Healy and Templeton labs in the UK and the Cousin lab in Germany. So yeah, and of course, all of the funding that has allowed me to actually conduct all of these experiments. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora, for the pictorial explained, very pictures with very much fantasy and very good explained talk. I really liked it. And I was also thinking during your beginning on the now Corona crisis, which we have, which changed the noisy world. And we humans, I think we like this sometimes, like we have a airplane coming in here over our house every morning at 6 o'clock, and it was not here for 3 months. But the first morning today it came back, so I didn't miss this airplane.
Yep.
How we heard also a lot more of birds here, of animals. Yeah, I'm really curious what is coming out, what your colleagues or what science will bring up from this time.
Yeah, I've been
noise with less noise.
Yeah, I've been talking to a couple of people, and one of the slightly unfortunate things is that for some of my colleagues, the lockdown happened right before their field season. So like a week before they were set to go out and set all their recorders out and start doing that. But I do know that there are some very long-term projects that have been recording all sorts of long-term sound in the environment, and they're continuing to record, and they have been recording during the entire pandemic lockdown time. And they're hoping that we're going to actually get some really cool results sometime, either this winter or early next year, I think.
And I also was thinking you mentioned chemical pollution, heating, cutting plants. I think noise and light pollution is something we don't think that directly, but it's something which, especially in big villages, big cities, is something which really also makes an impact on us. And I don't know what this makes on all the animals as well. So sometimes I don't know, sometimes I try to just hear what I hear and which noise comes and which is the next, with overlapping and the next and the next. And it's quite impressive how much artificial noise we have.
It's quite shocking. And one of the other things that a lot of scientists are also kind of interested in looking at, and why things like mobbing calls have started to get a lot of attention, is because one of the things that we've seen with a lot of bird song, for example, is that they can increase their frequency. So human noise and human generated noise tends to be very low frequency or low pitch, whereas bird song especially tends to be a bit higher pitch, except for some species like crows, where you have this much lower pitch, kind of general, all calls are kind of quite a bit lower. But what they've also realized is that, especially in a lot of temperate areas, many of the mobbing calls are much lower down as well. So they're in the same really basically bad frequencies to be heard over human noise. And so they're in more danger of being drowned out in some ways than some songs are, for example. And so this noise has very different effects on different species and different types of calls based on basically how high pitched those calls are. And so it's something that, again, is starting to get more attention because we don't know how flexible birds are in their ability to change their calls. We know that some of them can change song, but we don't know how flexible calls are. And so if they can't change, then it means that these calls are just not being heard, and the birds might not be able to change their behavior to make them heard.
I remember one picture, this is more for light pollution, where I think it's a blackbird, a starling, is nesting in a traffic light in the middle of the city, which is also maybe interesting. Maybe they also like it, I don't know.
Yeah, starlings are, so one of the things that's very interesting about starlings is that obviously many people see them because they do quite well in cities. And one of the reasons why we wanted to specifically try to find populations that didn't necessarily live around big cities, but that they have the songs that they use. A lot of their songs have this really broad range of frequency. So some of it's really high and some of it's not. But a lot of their calls are much lower frequency. And so they, for example, might be a species that some things they can adjust quite easily to human noise, but some things they can't. Or they have to change when they're calling, or they have to change how they're calling in terms of, do they have to call more in order to be heard? Do they have to call louder in order to be heard? And so they're kind of an interesting species to look at for that as well.
Well, we have some more questions in our chat. There is the question, were the mobbing calls ever observed with other species? I think you mentioned some species than birds.
Yeah, so we think that mobbing is found in almost every taxa. So it's the most well studied in birds by far, because it's very easy to see in birds. We know that a lot of mammals do it. So meerkats are a really good example. Ground squirrels, they mob a lot of snakes. A lot of primate species mob as well. I think other species haven't been as well studied because people just kind of don't think about them when they think about mobbing. There have been a few studies that have shown that fish mob, so a couple of different species of fish. For the definitions of mobbing that I use, I would consider Japanese honeybees to mob because they will aggressively attack a certain type of hornet, I believe, and they will actually try to kill it in order to make sure that it can't come in and kill the entire colony. So we think that there are definitely insects that mob. There has been, as far as I can tell, almost no study looking at reptiles or amphibians, however. And I think just people know about mobbing in birds, so they look for it in birds, but I think that most taxa have species in them that mob.
I remember one project where I think they used bee sounds to get elephants out of the farmer areas. I think that's also something like this mobbing, no? Might be.
Yeah, definitely. It's a way to protect yourself or to protect a group against a threat that's not immediate. So it's not an actively hunting individual, but it's something that their very presence increases the danger that you're in. And so it's a good way for animals to defend against that. So to get predators out of the area, or in the case of bees, especially if elephants either routinely trample or take apart bees' nests, it might be a way for bees to make sure their nests aren't destroyed by when they come across, or rather when an elephant comes across them. If they attack the elephant, that might serve that purpose.
So there's another question. It is all about their calls and communication, or is facial expression and body language also a thing for birds?
So I don't know nearly as much about that. One of the things that's really interesting about mobbing behavior is that if you talk to anybody who recognizes it, they will be able to tell you immediately if a bird is mobbing or not, or any animal really. And that's because a lot of the behavior is stereotyped. So it's something that there are very specific behaviors that are used in very specific ways. So for example, with mobbing, In birds, a lot of the things that you get are things like flip-flopping, which is what I call it, where if you have a bird on a branch, it'll kind of go back and forth really quickly. They'll bob up and down. They'll flick their wings out really fast. They'll kind of go whoosh, and they'll often bob their tail up and down as well. And these are things that you might see occasionally, some of these behaviors in other circumstances, but you don't see them put together the way that they are, except for in mobbing. And a lot of this also might be kind of signaling the predator, because it's part of mobbing is to show the predator that you've found it. And so by being very easy to see, by drawing attention to yourself with these types of movements as well, might be a way to show the predator that you've found it, but also show the predator that you're aggressive and you might be willing to actually attack it. So there might be, and I know that in fish, you get a lot of aggressive displays towards predators in species that mob. So they'll actually try to bite a lot of the predators as well, but they will also perform very specific behaviors that you see in other confrontation contexts. So it might be something where two males are fighting with each other and they do a lot of display behavior. That you might see similar behavior of the fish that's mobbing a predator do the same type of thing, to let it know that I've seen you and I'm willing to get aggressive. Move along. Do not eat my young. So.
And there is, I don't know, is there, yeah, this is, I think, not a really question. This is a thank you for the interesting explanations, and hope we will hear more from your project when all the other results are in, which I also hope. So if we don't have any more question, I really would like to have you again on this online talk when you have the results.
Yeah, I would be happy. That would be very exciting to do again.
So let's do that. And in between, for the audience, we will have at some stage in future, I'm not sure, we have not a date at this time, also a talk about the technical part of the imaging barn, which was presented today from Nora. And we have next time, next Tuesday, we don't have a talk. We have 2 weeks, a little break, and then we have on the 13th of June, we have Hannes Bonsheim. You will get this talk announced also in our newsletter. So if you are interested, don't forget to subscribe this channel here and also our newsletter, and you get every new information about the next talks. So we are happy to have you with us here, and again next time, and have a good time the next 2 weeks, and goodbye, and thank you very much, Nora.
Thank you for having me. It's been very fun.
Yeah, fantastic talk today.